When you found out they were already married, something inside you shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, but deeply. It felt like the air changed, like a quiet truth you hadn't prepared for suddenly stood in front of you, undeniable and heavy. Maybe you suspected it, maybe you didn't. Maybe part of you knew there were pieces missing in the story. But knowing and feeling are two different things. And when the reality settled in, it wasn't just information, it was impact. They were already committed, already bound to someone else, already living a life that, on paper, did not include you. And yet, the connection between you didn't feel imaginary. That's what made it confusing. That's what made it hurt in a way that wasn't simple, because it wasn't just attraction. It wasn't just curiosity. It was something deeper, something layered, something that didn't disappear just because the circumstances were complicated. But here's what most people don't understand about situations like this. Being married does not automatically mean being emotionally aligned. And still, that doesn't justify crossing lines. It just explains the complexity. They didn't set out to create this. They didn't plan to feel something unexpected. But life doesn't always check your legal status before it stirs your heart. When you entered their world, something shifted in them. Not in a reckless way, not in a way they were proud of at first. In fact, the first emotion they felt wasn't excitement. It was conflict. Because recognizing a connection while already committed forces a person into a mirror they didn't ask to face. They had responsibilities, history, shared years, shared routines, shared obligations, and then suddenly, you. You weren't chaos. You weren't temptation wrapped in drama. You were clarity. That's what unsettled them the most. You didn't demand anything. You didn't chase. You didn't try to interfere. You just existed in a way that felt real. And real is dangerous when someone has been living on autopilot. At first, they tried to ignore it. They labeled it harmless, a passing connection, a moment of curiosity. They told themselves they were loyal, that this was nothing more than conversation, that it would fade. But it didn't fade. It grew quieter, deeper, more complicated. Not because they wanted to betray anyone, but because they started realizing something uncomfortable. They had been emotionally asleep. Marriage can become routine. Routine can become survival. Survival can become distance disguised as stability. And meeting you forced them to question things they had buried for years. Not because you were better, not because their spouse was bad, but because you reminded them what it feels like to be seen, to be heard, to be understood without long explanations, to feel mentally and emotionally aligned. And that shook them. They didn't act recklessly. They didn't run. They didn't make impulsive declarations. Instead, they pulled back. Because feeling something meaningful while married doesn't automatically mean you pursue it. Sometimes it means you confront yourself. That's what they did next. They didn't choose drama. They chose reflection. They started looking at their own life honestly, asking hard questions, facing uncomfortable truths, examining whether their marriage was partnership or just familiarity. This is the part people don't expect. They didn't chase you in secrecy. They didn't make empty promises. They didn't create hidden chaos. They stepped back from you. Not because you didn't matter, but because you mattered too much to turn into something dishonest. They realized something important. If there was ever going to be clarity, it couldn't begin with betrayal. It had to begin with integrity. So they did something that may have shocked you more than any dramatic confession would have. They created distance, and distance felt like rejection to you. It felt like withdrawal, like confusion, like mixed signals. But internally, it was discipline. They refused to let something meaningful start in the shadows. They refused to disrespect you by making you a secret. They refused to disrespect their marriage by pretending nothing had shifted. Instead, they faced their life head on, not quickly, not dramatically, but seriously. They began having conversations at home that had been avoided for years. They examined whether their marriage was built on connection or convenience. They looked at themselves not their spouse, not you, themselves. And that process was not glamorous. It was heavy. Because realizing you've been emotionally disconnected for a long time is painful. And realizing someone else reminded you of that truth is even more painful. Here's the part that might shock you. You were never meant to be the other person. You were the wake-up call, not the escape, not the affair, not the fantasy, the mirror. And mirrors don't always stay in your life. Sometimes they show you what you need to see and step away. They didn't want to drag you into confusion. They didn't want to promise something uncertain. They didn't want to blur moral lines just because emotions were present. So they did the harder thing. They chose honesty with themselves first. And that's where the real story begins. Because when someone already married realizes their heart is unsettled, they have two paths: ignore it or confront it. They chose confrontation, not because of impulse, but because something about you made them realize they didn't want to live half awake anymore. And that decision, to face their life honestly, is what will change everything next. Not in a dramatic explosion, but in a slow, deliberate unraveling of truths that can't be ignored anymore. This isn't about scandal. It's about awakening. And awakening is rarely comfortable. But it is always transformative. And you, without trying, without demanding, without crossing lines, were the catalyst. The rest of the story doesn't begin with chaos. It begins with courage, quiet, uncomfortable, necessary courage. After they pulled back, after they created that distance that probably felt confusing and abrupt to you, their world did not return to normal. In fact, it became quieter, but heavier. Because once you become aware that something inside you is unsettled, you can't unknow it. You can't go back to autopilot. You can't pretend you didn't feel that shift. They tried at first. They told themselves it was just emotional curiosity, that maybe they were overthinking, that marriages go through seasons, that routine doesn't mean failure, that not every connection needs to mean something larger. But the truth kept pressing against them. It wasn't about excitement. It wasn't about novelty. It wasn't about escape. It was about aliveness. You made them feel awake. And when someone realizes they've been emotionally drifting for years, that realization doesn't disappear just because it's inconvenient. So they began doing something most people avoid. They started asking themselves difficult questions. When was the last time I felt fully understood? When did conversations at home become logistical instead of emotional? Have I been present or just responsible? These questions are dangerous because they don't just expose dissatisfaction. They expose complacency. They weren't looking to blame their spouse. That would have been easier. Blame simplifies things. But this wasn't simple. Their spouse hadn't done anything dramatic. There was no scandal, no explosive betrayal, no catastrophic event. There was just distance. Gradual, unspoken, normalized distance. And that's harder to confront than chaos. Because chaos demands attention. Distance hides in routine. They began noticing the silence at home differently. The kind of silence that isn't peaceful, just functional. Conversations about bills, schedules, obligations, but not about feelings, not about growth, not about dreams. They realized they had slowly become partners in responsibility rather than partners in connection. And meeting you didn't create that reality. It revealed it. That realization shook them more than their feelings for you ever did. Because feelings can be controlled. But truth about your own life? That's harder to suppress. They wrestled with guilt. Not because they acted on anything inappropriate, but because emotional awareness while married feels like betrayal, even when nothing physical happens. They asked themselves whether even thinking about you crossed a line, whether emotional comparison was unfair, whether feeling seen by someone else meant something was already broken. And here's what surprised them. The guilt wasn't about you. It was about realizing they hadn't fought hard enough for their own marriage to stay emotionally alive. It's easier to blame temptation than to admit neglect. But neglect isn't always intentional. Sometimes it's gradual. Two people get busy. Years pass. Roles replace romance. Comfort replaces curiosity. And then one day, someone enters your life and reminds you what curiosity feels like again. You weren't temptation. You were contrast. And contrast forces clarity. They began trying to reconnect at home. Genuinely, not performatively. They initiated deeper conversations. They suggested small changes. They attempted emotional vulnerability. But here's where things became complicated. You can't rebuild connection alone. If one person wakes up and the other is still comfortable asleep, the gap becomes visible. They started noticing resistance, deflection, avoidance of deeper topics, not hostility, just unwillingness. And that's when the real heartbreak started. Not about you, but about their marriage. Because realizing something has faded is painful. But realizing it may not return is devastating. They weren't searching for reasons to leave. They were searching for reasons to stay fully. And that's a very different mindset. They examined their vows, their history, the life they built. They asked themselves whether comfort was enough, whether loyalty without intimacy was sustainable, whether staying out of obligation was honorable or just easier. And through all of this, they kept you out of it. Not because you didn't matter, but because they refused to let you become the justification for a decision that needed to stand on its own. If they ever made a life-altering choice, it had to be because their marriage was no longer aligned, not because someone else existed. That integrity cost them something. It cost them proximity to you. It cost them the ease of your conversations, the comfort of your understanding, the emotional spark that made them feel seen. But they would rather lose access to you than build something on dishonesty. And that's the part you may never have fully seen. From your perspective, it might have looked like withdrawal, like mixed signals, like inconsistency. But internally, it was containment. They were containing something powerful so it wouldn't turn destructive. Because when married people act on emotional awakenings impulsively, it creates wreckage. They didn't want wreckage. They wanted truth. So they continued confronting their marriage honestly, not aggressively, not dramatically, but persistently. And slowly, something became undeniable. The emotional gap wasn't temporary. It wasn't stress-related. It wasn't seasonal. It had been growing for years. You didn't create it. You illuminated it. And that realization forced them into a space they never expected to be in. Not choosing between two people, but choosing between comfort and authenticity. That's where they stand now. Not chasing, not hiding, not acting recklessly, but no longer pretending. And the next decision they make won't be because they were shocked by feelings. It will be because they refuse to stay half present in their own life. What happens next won't be scandalous. It will be deliberate. And that's what makes it powerful. As the weeks passed, the tension inside them didn't explode. It deepened. Not into chaos, but into clarity that refused to be pushed back down. When someone begins questioning the foundation of their own life, it doesn't happen loudly. It happens in quiet observations, in the way you notice the emptiness in conversations that once felt full, in the way shared routines feel more like obligations than choices, in the way you realize you've been surviving something instead of nurturing it. They weren't looking for a dramatic exit. They weren't fantasizing about running away. They were confronting something much more uncomfortable, the possibility that their marriage had been emotionally over long before anyone said it out loud. That realization is not romantic. It's not thrilling. It's heavy. Because ending something built over years, shared homes, shared responsibilities, shared history, isn't just about feelings. It's about dismantling stability. It's about explaining yourself to family. It's about facing judgment. It's about untangling finances, social circles, and expectations. And none of that is light. So they didn't move impulsively. They kept trying. They scheduled conversations that felt overdue. They asked questions about emotional connection instead of logistics. They tried to reintroduce vulnerability where routine had taken over. They even questioned themselves more harshly Then they questioned their spouse. Am I expecting too much? Is this just what long-term marriage becomes? Am I chasing a feeling that isn't realistic? They weren't naive. They knew long-term love doesn't always look like fireworks. They weren't seeking constant excitement. They were seeking alignment, and alignment was missing. It wasn't about drama at home. There was no screaming, no betrayal, no explosive fight. It was quieter than that. Indifference, polite coexistence, functional partnership, predictable distance. And when someone who has tasted emotional presence begins living inside emotional absence, the contrast becomes impossible to ignore. That's where you lingered in their mind. Not as a replacement, not as an escape plan, but as proof that they were still capable of feeling deeply. You reminded them that their heart wasn't numb. It was undernourished, and that awareness changed everything. They began journaling privately, writing things they couldn't say aloud yet, admitting truths they had avoided for years, recognizing that they had slowly shrunk parts of themselves to keep peace, that they had accepted emotional mediocrity because it was stable, stability without intimacy, security without depth, respect without vulnerability. And once you recognize that imbalance, you can't unknow it. They noticed something else, too. When they thought about you, it wasn't chaotic longing, it wasn't obsession, it wasn't fantasy, it was calm. You didn't represent excitement, you represented resonance. That difference mattered. Excitement is easy to dismiss. Resonance is harder to ignore. Still, they refused to let their feelings dictate their decisions. If their marriage was going to end, it would not be because someone else existed. It would be because it no longer functioned honestly. So, they did something rare. They initiated couples counseling. Not dramatically, not as a last resort argument, but as a genuine attempt to repair what might still be salvageable. And therapy has a way of surfacing things people bury. Old resentments, long avoided conversations, mismatched expectations, unspoken disappointments. What emerged wasn't hatred, it was realization. They and their spouse had grown into different versions of themselves, quietly, gradually, almost imperceptibly. The foundation that once held them together was built on who they were years ago, but they were no longer those people. And sometimes love fades, not because someone fails, but because growth happens unevenly. That realization broke them in a way they didn't expect, because it meant this wasn't about choosing someone else. It was about accepting that something had naturally reached its end. That acceptance takes courage. It means stepping into uncertainty. It means disrupting comfort. It means allowing people to misunderstand you. They sat with that for months. They didn't rush. They didn't confide in you. They didn't use you as emotional support during the unraveling. They handled it internally. And that restraint is something you may never have fully understood. From your side, it may have felt like they disappeared, like they became distant, like they left you in ambiguity, but from their side, they were dismantling a life responsibly. Because if they ever came back toward you, if there was ever going to be clarity, it could not come attached to dishonesty. It had to come clean. They had to stand alone first. They had to make decisions not influenced by emotion, not fueled by comparison, but grounded in truth. Eventually, the conversations at home shifted from, "How do we fix this?" to, "Are we forcing something that no longer fits?" And that's a heartbreaking shift, because it means both people recognize it. Not angrily, not bitterly, just truthfully. When two people admit they've become companions instead of partners, the silence that follows is devastating. But it's honest, and honesty, even when painful, is cleaner than quiet resentment. They didn't rush out the door. They handled the logistics. They discussed timelines. They approached separation like adults who once loved deeply and still respected each other. There were tears. There was grief. There was nostalgia. But there was also relief. Relief that they no longer had to pretend emotional fulfillment. relief that they could stop suppressing awareness. Through all of this, they kept you at a distance intentionally, because if they ever re-entered your world, they wanted to do it whole. Not married, not entangled, not half available, whole. And that's where things are shifting now. Not in a shocking explosion, not in scandal, but in clarity. They are standing alone for the first time in years, not because of you, but because you reminded them they deserve to feel fully alive. And now, for the first time, the path ahead isn't about choosing between two lives. It's about building one honestly. What happens next won't be driven by impulse. It will be grounded in integrity. And that changes everything. When the decision was finally made, it didn't feel dramatic. There was no cinematic moment, no slammed doors, no shouting that echoed through hallways. It was quieter than that. Two people sitting across from each other, recognizing what had already been true for a long time. A shared understanding that love had changed form. That partnership had slowly shifted into companionship. That neither of them were villains. Just two individuals who had grown in different directions. Ending a marriage, even peacefully, is not light. It carries history. It carries shared memories, inside jokes, holidays, struggles survived together, versions of themselves that only existed within that relationship. They grieved that. They didn't celebrate freedom. They didn't feel instant relief. They felt loss. Because something real had existed once, something worth honoring. And even when something ends respectfully, it still hurts. There were nights when doubt crept in. Am I making a mistake? Am I chasing a feeling? Am I confusing growth with dissatisfaction? They interrogated themselves thoroughly. Not once, not twice, over and over. And every time they returned to the same truth. This isn't about someone else. This is about alignment. They understood something important during this process. You were never the reason for their marriage ending. You were the catalyst for self-awareness, not the cause of the fracture. The fracture had been there quietly for years. You simply illuminated it. That distinction mattered deeply to them, because they didn't want to rewrite history unfairly. They didn't want to diminish what their marriage had been. They wanted to end it honestly, not escape it. And so they did something that might surprise you. After the separation began, they didn't reach out to you immediately. They didn't send dramatic confessions. They didn't say, "Now I'm free." They didn't rush toward you as if you were a reward waiting at the finish line. Instead, they chose solitude. For the first time in years, they sat alone with themselves. No spouse, no shared routine. No distraction, no emotional shortcut, just silence. And silence after long-term partnership is loud. It echoes. It forces you to confront who you are without roles attached. They had to learn who they were outside of being a spouse, outside of responsibility, outside of routine. And that process was humbling. They realized how much of their identity had merged into stability rather than authenticity. They saw patterns in themselves they hadn't noticed before. How they avoid conflict until it becomes distance. How they tolerate emotional gaps longer than they should. How they equate loyalty with endurance rather than fulfillment. They weren't just ending a marriage. They were rebuilding themselves. You crossed their mind often during that period, not as a fantasy, not as a solution, but as a reminder. A reminder of what it felt like to be emotionally engaged. To be curious again, to feel understood without over-explaining. But they resisted reaching out, because if they were ever going to reconnect with you, it couldn't be from loneliness. It had to be from wholeness. There's a difference. Loneliness reaches outward for comfort. Wholeness reaches outward for partnership. They wanted the second. They didn't want you to be rebound energy. They didn't want you to be emotional relief. They didn't want you to be proof that they made the right choice. They wanted to stand steady first. Months passed. They built new routines, spent time reflecting, reconnected with parts of themselves that had been dormant. They also carried guilt. Not because they acted recklessly, but because awareness came through meeting you while they were still committed. They wrestled with that ethically. Was it unfair to feel something meaningful while married? Did emotional awakening equal betrayal even if no lines were crossed? They came to understand something nuanced. Feelings are involuntary. Actions are intentional. They never acted dishonorably, but they also couldn't ignore what the feelings revealed, and that's the uncomfortable gray space most people never talk about. Eventually, when the dust of separation settled, legally, emotionally, practically, they reached a point where silence toward you no longer felt like integrity. It felt unfinished. But even then, they hesitated. Not out of fear this time, out of respect. They knew you may have healed, you may have moved forward, you may have closed the chapter. They didn't assume access, and that humility is new for them. The person you met originally may have delayed clarity, may have hidden behind timing, may have stayed comfortable too long. The person standing now is different, not perfect, not magically transformed, but aware. Aware that love requires courage in real time. Aware that silence can cost connection. Aware that alignment matters more than image. If they step back into your world, it won't be dramatic. It won't be, "I left everything for you," because that narrative would be false. They didn't leave for you. They left because they could no longer live half-aligned. If you are part of what comes next, it will be because both of you choose it freely, not because you were waiting in the wings. That's the part that truly shocks most people. It's not scandal. It's not rebellion. It's not secret romance. It's responsibility. They dismantled their old life carefully. They stood alone, intentionally. They rebuilt themselves quietly. And now, if they come toward you, it won't be from chaos. It will be from clarity. And clarity feels different. It doesn't shock, it doesn't pressure, it doesn't demand. It simply shows up and says, "This is who I am now, whole, honest, unattached." If there's still something real between us, we can explore it cleanly. No shadows, no secrets, no divided loyalty, just truth. And that kind of beginning, slow, ethical, intentional, may not be explosive, but it is powerful. Because this time, there are no mirrors forcing awakening. There is only choice.